Hi, this is Jason Baker, and welcome to week 8 of our DevOps and Cloud Infrastructure course. This week, we're going to focus on DevOps practices, which is quite a change from most of the lectures that we've had in this course so far. We're going to focus on more of the business side of DevOps versus the technology side. So let's look at the agenda for the lecture. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps and just get you reacquainted with the practices and the philosophy of DevOps. I'm going to show you how lean theory has greatly impacted and informed DevOps practices. We'll look at some of the sort of key foundational components of DevOps. We'll look at DevOps culture. We'll talk about things like design for operations. We'll look at automation and how we can use infrastructure as code to augment and to automate our DevOps processes. And then finally, we'll talk about things like code pipelines and how we go about testing in a DevOps organization. Okay, let's jump in. So I began this course many weeks ago talking about DevOps and providing you with a definition of DevOps. And I just want to reacquaint you quickly with this definition. When I talk about DevOps, what I'm talking about is a set of business practices, which is a collaborative effort within the organization to improve the quality and velocity of our service lifecycle. And within our organizations, as we're developing applications and as we're managing our services, we we have to perform a number of different steps and stages during the life cycle of any given service. We might start off by planning and coding and building applications. We'll take those applications through some sort of testing process. And then finally, we will release and deploy the application and allow our customers to use it. And while that application or service is deployed, we're operating it, we're monitoring it, we're fixing any sort of bugs, and we're patching security issues. And then we start all over again. We plan to add new features and we code those features, we build them and test them, and so on. And this entire service lifecycle requires a collaboration between all different types of people in our IT organization. We might have developers and quality assurance people. We'll have operations and database specialists. We'll have product managers, maybe project managers as well. And this collaborative effort everybody is engaged in is to improve this service delivery lifecycle. And as you'll see, one of the ways we can improve that service delivery lifecycle is by increasing the velocity of this cycle, by developing code faster and by releasing and deploying that code more quickly to our customers, but doing so in a way that maintains a very high level of quality. You might be asking yourself the question, well, is this idea of collaborating around a service lifecycle and improving the quality and velocity of our service, is this thing really new? Well, operations people have been automating system configurations for decades. We've been automating the deployment of our applications using things like shell scripts and pixie boots. We've had virtual machine environments like VMware around for almost 2 decades now. So we've had the ability to create snapshots and templates of our applications and environments. Developers have been automating the builds of applications for decades using tools like Make and Ant, using version control systems like CVS, Subversion, and now more recently Git. So when I talk about and explain many of the sort of underlying technologies that underpin these DevOps practices, you one thing you need to realize is that the technologies have been around for a very long time. And these more recent DevOps practices build upon decades and decades of previous practices in IT. So, one thing to realize is that, you know, and this is sort of why DevOps exists as a practice today, is that despite all of these different technologies which have existed, despite our ability to automate software deployments and automate software builds and releases, despite all those decades of effort, we still ran into problems in our IT organizations. You may have seen this popular meme on the internet over the past few years, and this is a very common sort of scenario that you'll hear when you work with most any organization that's doing application development. The developers will write code and they'll test it on their workstation, and that code works just fine. And their workstation and maybe their testing environment. And then once they move that code into a production environment, then all hell breaks loose. The code fails and unforeseen problems pop up, and the developers say, well, hey, the code worked just fine on my workstation. I don't know why doesn't work in the production environment. That's not my problem. That's the operations team's problem to figure out. And then what ultimately happens in many organizations is that you have this partition which forms, this wall that forms between the development team and the operations team. The development team is writing code and then throwing that code over the wall to the operations team, and the operations team has to figure out how to make it work. And the development team and operations team, they have differing concerns. The development team wants to make changes, right? The development team is writing new code. They're creating pull requests on their Git repository. They're testing and building new releases. So the development team is constantly involved in making change. And the operations team is charged with trying to make things stable. So the operations team is trying to minimize change. And what happens over time is this natural tension can form between these two parts of our organization. And these two teams have different conflicting measures of success. The development team's success is measured by the rate of change, by the number of lines of code that they're writing, or the number of code commits, the number of Scrum stories, and the number of the Scrum story points that are approved each iteration. The development teams are rewarded based upon the amount of change that they're creating. On the other hand, these operations teams are measured by things like service uptime and service level agreements, the performance of the application in the production environment. So the operations team's success is measured by the stability of the application. And again, this creates this tension between the two teams. And the operations team is really put oftentimes in a very unfair position. They didn't create the code, they didn't write it, but yet they are in a role where their success is measured based upon their ability uh, to support that code. In IT, we're constantly trying to mitigate risks, and we're trying to manage the risks that are introduced by change. And traditionally, the way we managed risk within our organizations but was by trying to change as infrequently as we possibly could. And we would only change when absolutely necessary. When we when we needed to make changes in our application or operations, then we would elect to make those changes at really inconvenient times. They were inconvenient for us as operations people, but convenient for our customers. So we would we would deploy updates to our application at 2 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday morning when all of our staff members were home asleep. We would be up and awake and applying updates to our production environment. And hopefully that was at a time that would minimize a disruption to our customers as well. When we would make changes, we would try to batch changes together because again, we were making changes pretty infrequently. Maybe we would try to deploy a major update to our production environment once a quarter. So once every 3 months, we would batch all of these different application changes together, and we would pick a maintenance window early in a Sunday morning, and we would apply all these changes at once. That was the way that we attempted to manage risk within our IT organizations. Change as infrequently as we can, and only absolutely when absolutely necessary. Do it at choose a maintenance window at a time that wasn't disruptive to our customers, that was very inconvenient for us, and then since we change so infrequently, let's let's batch as many changes together as we possibly can to get all the changes in during this short maintenance window. Well, that traditional process of managing change in our IT organizations led to something that I call the slippery slope of IT change management. So, and the slippery slope kind of goes like this. The idea is that we know that anytime we make changes to our application or platform, there's some risk involved in the change, no matter how small that change is. And we also know that over time, we're going to have to make changes to our application. It's just an inevitable part of doing business. So, in order to minimize the risk associated with the changes that we need to make, we try not to make changes very often. We try to limit the number of times that we need to change. But the longer we wait to make changes to our application and our platforms, the more things we inevitably have to change. Developers are writing code, they're fixing bugs, they're adding new features. And these code changes are accruing. They're growing over time. And at some point, we're going to have to deploy those changes. So over time, the longer we wait to make changes, the greater amount of risk, the greater the risk is growing. It's like this bubble. This risk bubble is expanding as the number of code changes we need to make, and as the longer we wait, the bubble is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it potentially bursts. So by choosing to make changes infrequently, instead of mitigating, instead of managing risks, we're actually increasing the risk to our organization. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been in working in IT for over 2 decades now, I can tell you that at first this idea, this slippery slope of IT change management, seems counterintuitive to us when we're working in IT. It seems to make sense that if change is risky, then we shouldn't engage in risky behavior. We should try to avoid risky behavior as much as possible. We should wait as long as possible until we really have to make those changes. And when we do, we should pick a really convenient time, and we should try to make all the changes that we can in sort of one shot in a batch. For decades, that made sense. But today we now know better. We now know that this very common practice actually increases the risk of change within our organizations. And I'll show you why that is. Well, so to understand DevOps practices, you have to understand three of the key components that make up the DevOps practices and the philosophy around DevOps. And those three practices, or those three sort of foundational components, are culture, automation, and measurement. These three components really comprise the practices in a DevOps in an organization that's practicing DevOps practices. Before I jump into these three components, I want to address some very common misconceptions that you might hear about DevOps. And these are quotes that I've heard from organizations that I've consulted with over the past few years. The first misconception is that your organization needs to hire special DevOps people, and it needs to build a DevOps team in order to implement DevOps practices. And nothing could be further from the truth. This idea that there are DevOps people out there, DevOps engineers, and that your team can't implement these practices unless it creates this brand new DevOps team is absolutely false. It's silly. The whole idea behind DevOps and the DevOps culture is that we want to break down the natural silos that form within organizations. And there's natural silos that form around the IT operations team and the IT development team and the quality assurance team and so on. We want to break down those silos. We want to eliminate them if possible. The last thing we want to do is create yet another new silo, a new team that is the team that's supposed to focus on DevOps practices. Everybody focuses on DevOps practices. Everybody in that sense is doing DevOps. The second misconception is that DevOps is all about automation. And DevOps means that we just need to try to automate stuff better. Well, that's not true either. Automation is a key component in DevOps, but I think most of us who embrace DevOps practices would argue that DevOps is really mostly about creating a culture. And it's a culture which is focused on improving the quality and velocity of service delivery. Automation is really key to improving the velocity and quality of service delivery. That's a key technology component. But if that's the only component that your organization is focused on, then you're going to really struggle to implement all the other practices within DevOps. And then finally, there's this misconception that if you if you want to implement DevOps practices in your organization, all you need to do is just go out and buy the right tools. If you go out and buy a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline tool, or if you buy an infrastructure definition tool, or you buy, some sort of like artifact repository and version control tool, now you're doing DevOps. Now you're practicing DevOps. Well, again, DevOps is mostly about the culture, and there are a set of business practices around DevOps that don't involve any tools. They involve human beings. They involve breaking down these silos. They involve the coordination of activities. So again, oftentimes people get lost in the tools, and they focus their time and effort on trying to pick the right tool versus thinking about the culture of their organization and how they might align the culture around this set of practices. I see that vendors especially are out there trying to push their wares, and they're telling organizations that, hey, if you want to implement DevOps practices, then you need to buy my tool. Well, they're just trying to sell your CIO or CTO or VP of IT. They're trying to sell them on their tooling, and they're using the promise of DevOps as a way to sell their tool. But just because your organization buys that tool does not mean that your organization has now implemented DevOps practices.